welcome to ICT's podcast series. We just are kicking this off for 2023. We have a great slate of podcasts this year lined up for you. And this one is going to be focused on legislative issues, both issues that will impact the insurance industry, issues that we should be watching and paying attention to, and what those impacts are. Today, what we're going to do is just a brief overview of all of the topics that we're keeping an eye on. And joining us today is Albert Betts. He's the Executive Director for the Insurance Council of Texas. Angie Cervantes, she's Government Relations Manager for the Insurance Council of Texas. And Jay Thompson with Thompson Co., who is General Counsel for ICT and does additional work with AFACT. We're excited to have all of them here today talking about these important issues and how they impact the insurance market here in Texas, to make sure that we are, our goal is to always have a competitive and strong insurance environment here in Texas as we move forward. A couple of things: we do have a symposium. Go to insurancecouncil.org. Our annual symposium will be in Dallas this year, July 12th through the 14th. So if you want to register for that, go ahead and do it. We are open and we're really excited about that agenda. We also have a webinar series each month towards the end of the month, where we have a webinar series where we cover topics, everything from wildfires to hiring practices to all sorts of different topics that impact the insurance industry. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and kick it off. Albert, welcome to the podcast. I'm just going to kind of let you guys go for it and cover all the issues that we're going to be covering today.
All right. Well, thank you, Rich. Appreciate the introduction. Thank you, Jay and Angie, for joining me today. We've got a lot to talk about. Legislative session is probably going to be the highlight or low light of the year, depending upon your point of view. But let's talk about what's going on so far. We are 48 days into session by my count of a 140-day session. So thankfully or woefully, there's still only 92 days left. But let's talk about what may impact property and casualty, kind of what the session, how it has started, what's driving leadership and what is of concern to them, and just give a general overview of what our members in the industry has to look forward to this session. Turn it over to you first, Jay.
I think, we always talk about the big issues, number one of which is the budget, because they have to fund state government for another 2 years and pass a budget. And they have a record amount of surplus available, even though there are limitations on how much they can spend. And so there's going to have to be very careful how they do that, because of constitutional amendments that limit spending from a previous session. They may add new categories of spending. You're talking a lot. You hear the governor talk about his priorities and education funding. I think security for schools is a big issue. Border security is a big issue. Education is by far and away the largest item where we spend money, and that's both higher education and public education. A lot of talk about charter schools. The lieutenant governor has listed certain priority bills, and they kind of fit in that category. Interestingly, the speaker came out with 4 bills that were priority. One was a data privacy bill. Another one expanding Medicaid for new mothers, and then securing children online. And so those are some of the issues that I think the leadership are pushing. We're also hearing a lot about ESG and are seeing bills on that coming from Chairman Oliverson and others on that issue. And, in the next few days, getting through these budget fights and stuff and having a lot of bills is going to be a very interesting session, because the big issues will dominate everything else.
Well, Angie, you worked over in the Senate at one point, so you've been under the pink dome Has this session started out unusually slow, or is this about average given the pace of committees being named and bills being filed?
I think that it started off maybe a little slow as far as bill filing goes, but as of the end of last week, we were actually ahead in bills filed, and it's starting to pick up the pace. And as we've heard, House Insurance is meeting next week, and so it's pretty typical that in February things start gearing up. And then, as Jay said, there's emergency items, and statutorily they're not allowed to take up anything besides governor emergency items within the first 60 days. And we're approaching that, which is March 10th. So we'll see more bills start to get heard in committee and things like that. So, and it is interesting though, and I think we could talk about Senate and House committees a little, maybe Jay, because one thing that is interesting as far as from other sessions, usually we know where bills are going, or we have an idea. In the House, that's all done by rule. So we know House Insurance gets insurance and B&I gets workers' comp. In the Senate, it's always been more discretionary with the Lieutenant Governor, but typically those went to B&C, Business and Commerce, and then last session, Jurisprudence. So, but this time we're seeing them go to different places, right? Jay, do you want to talk maybe a little bit about the
Brian
politicking?
Hughes,
yeah,
Brian Hughes is chairman of State Affairs and Judiciary, and he's filed a number of insurance bills, and the members are lobbying to get their bills sent to their committees. Business and Commerce, chaired by Dr. Schwartner. That committee has got 11 members now instead of 9, and it will still get some business and it'll still get some insurance bills, but they've been slow referring bills also in the Senate. Workers' comp, I've seen a couple of workers' comp bills go to Senate Business and Commerce. And it'll be interesting to see where the electric utility regulation, that's always a hot topic. And even after this session, that's going to be another hot topic, I think, in the Senate, and likely probably go to State Affairs instead of Senate Business and Commerce. But we will see on that. And the last thing that I've observed is subcommittees in Senate Finance that may get some types of insurance bills. So I think it's really within the discretion of the Lieutenant Governor, Angie, and I think recognizes he's in a pretty powerful position, and you can expect that he's going to continue to operate with that in mind.
I think that's where it's going to be interesting too, for the bills that we are paying attention to, where they go, having a sense of who's on that committee, and then also, like you said, maybe certain insurance issues, P&C issues, go to B&C. But we've seen Brian Hughes already take the lead a little bit with some of the ESG stuff, so maybe we'll see that go to that committee, and the political makeup is a little bit different, so it'll be interesting.
Right.
Angie, how many bills have we seen that are P&C related, or are we tracking so far?
We're tracking over 200 bills. We've identified close to 60 as really related to P&C, but we're tracking over 200. We always track anything that might be related, things like the budget or state agency rulemaking. We're tracking a lot of ESG, gun liability bills, things like that. So we're already off and running.
Yeah, and before we I want to talk about some of the subjects y'all have mentioned, ESG being amongst the most notable one. But for the folks who don't do legislative work or wonder, we talk about these committees and the makeup of the committees. Give a quick little primer on some of the changes we saw in the committees you referenced already. And then generally, how does the committee process work?
Well, I can start in the House. At least we've got several new members. Chairman Oliverson is still the chair of it. Returning is Dennis Paul is returning to the committee. and Lacey Hall. And then we have Ann Johnson, who's a Democrat, Julie Johnson, a Democrat, Marianne Perez and Phil Cortez, who are both Republicans that are coming back to the committee. And typically the chairman will hold hearings, and then, you know, they won't vote bills out till later, and then they'll vote bills out and recommend those to either a local calendar or to a regular calendar. And in the Senate, the chairman has a lot of discretion there, and the Senate likewise will hold hearings, but then they'll vote bills out in blocks. And a lot more behind the scenes negotiation between the senators. But the calendars committee in the Senate is lieutenant governor. Mm-hmm. In the House, you have to still, even though you may be voted out of your committee, you still have to get voted out and put on a calendar to get a bill out of the House. And
right, you just have so many more people too, just so many more. Yeah, whereas you have 31 senators, and but I guess in that sense too, the chairmanships are pretty strong. They're the gatekeepers, right? So it's really important what they let out of their committee.
In last session, I think you saw Oliverson just let just about anything out of his committee. I'm hearing this session, the speaker is telling chairman not to let a bill out of their committee unless the chairman's willing to vote for it on the floor. And so hopefully we may see more discretion this session on bills maybe not getting voted out of committee. Even though they may get a hearing, they may not get voted out of committee, and you may not see as much. But there's always a backlog, because you have to backlog the dates and timing around the 1st of May. You know, bills have to be on a calendar in the House to have a chance to survive. And so even though we're coming into March and hearings say the end of April, and then that first week in May is critical, because there'll be thousands of bills pending in calendars, and they may or may not get on the calendar and get heard.
That's true. We've said before that the process is set up to kill bills, and it is, especially in the House. In the Senate, they suspend the rules for you could suspend the rules for almost anything and get a bill filed, and you could even get the rule to file a bill suspended and file a bill late, and make it move through the process pretty quickly. But it's harder in the House. I think it's May 8th is the last day that House committees can even report bills out. So that means that a bill needs to get heard before that date to even have a chance. So it could either be good or bad depending on what we want to happen to the bill, right?
That's right. And in the Senate, a lot of bills they'll get on the local calendar. The gatekeeper there is chairman of administration committee, but the real gatekeeper is the lieutenant governor in the Senate. And the suspension of the rules requires a vote of 18 senators to suspend the rules. We've got 18 to 13, 18 Democrats and 18 Republicans and 13 Democrats. And the Republicans don't always agree on some stuff. So there are also issues where bills may not get enough votes to get a suspension of the rules in the Senate. So even if the lieutenant governor wants it up, then he's going to have to muscle it up if he wants it, if there's some pushback with the Republicans or Democrats pushing back.
That's also interesting this session. Well, not also, just as a side note, for those that, like you said, Albert, that might not follow the session that closely, the local calendar, we're referring to local, and then in the Senate, typically, and in the House, it usually follows those rules where there are bills that are considered local, so local matters that don't really, they're not controversial, they're not really any matter of substance, but the Senate, it could be pretty loose what gets sent to the local calendar. It could just be something that was passed unanimously in the committee. It could go to the local calendar and get passed out through administration. which means you don't have to go to the Senate floor and debate it, even if it's something that has some substance. So,
well, Angie, I can guess that as we're about to talk about the insurance issues, we should not expect many of those to be on local and consent calendar, because insurance is often not the everyone holds hand and agrees type of issue. So let's talk about, y'all named the leadership priorities. I did not hear insurance mentioned, which I guess is a good thing. But let's talk about some of the 3 or 4 big picture issues we're already seeing a lot of bills on, and that we'll be tracking and talking about throughout this session. And I'll just go back to ESG, which is attention-wise, besides another 4-letter word during this session, has dominated a lot of the early discussion. I want to kind of give a sense of what we're seeing happening with issues regarding ESG here in Texas, and maybe what we can expect moving forward.
Well, what we're seeing out of Representative Oliverson's office, he's promised there's going to be 3 or 4 ESG bills. We've only seen one, and it's very poorly worded and very broadly worded that just says you can't use ESG or diversity, equity, and inclusion scores in rating. And yet when you talk to his office, he keeps talking about underwriting. And Senator Hughes has filed a bill that talks about political discrimination, which is the use of an ESG score to require shareholders to adopt certain resolutions. And that bill's been filed in the Senate. We've talked to them about maybe if they're going to do something on ESG, not allow state agencies to adopt rules specific to ESG in an attempt to define that, environmental, social, and what constitute the components of governance in those components without legislative approval. No one seems to want to talk about that, and it seems to be a real political football where the Republicans are determined to fight woke corporations and fight these attempts to use ESG scores to prevent investments in fossil fuel industries. That's the biggest picture. That's where it seems to be going.
Yeah, and that when we were talking about podcasts with the whole topic, I think that could take up a whole other 30 minutes just going into what the bills do and what the implications are.
In the larger political fight, you're right, Jay. This is, I never thought I would be working in, quote, a woke industry. I don't think anybody generally would describe insurance as that, but this is part of a larger, if you look at those legislative priorities, they're often social issues. And so we're getting dragged into it in a fight over what some other states are doing about ESG related initiatives. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see where this ends up heading. What else should our members, whether they write personal or commercial coverage, what else should they keep an eye out for and follow what we're updating on during session?
I think in the auto front, there's attempts by the auto dealers to require use of OEM as a vendor bill that would favor them, so that you'd have to take a new car to them to get it repaired and use their parts and procedures. You have the body shops that want to get paid higher rates, and they want to pass legislation, and then appraisal in automobile insurance. Those are big. We expect a typical array of type of legislation favorable to plaintiffs bar in that. On the property side, you can't not talk about TWIA and funding and different approaches. There were some bills filed today. So TWIA is going to be a big issue.
I'm glad you said it. I was going to say, nobody's saying, we are not saying that 4-letter word yet, but yeah, so we just put it out there, TWIA. Yeah.
And so I think it's going to be relatively quiet on the workers' comp front and other commercial lines of business, Albert. I think on the property casualty, it'll be more in the personal lines and the consumer issues of appraisal and vendors trying to get advantage and stuff in that arena.
I think you're right. And then I think there's a replacement cost bill for homeowners out there that was a repeat from last session that we're paying close attention to. And then comp even, There's a bill out there that looks like an attempt to reverse the Rudiger decision, which took bad
Yes.
faith out of workers' comp. There's been multiple attempts since Rudiger passed. It was ruled on back in 2012, but definitely something to keep an eye on with the newness of the Business and Industry Committee.
And that committee, I don't even know if we talked about that committee, the makeup changed to where even politically they're now controlled by the Democrat side, which is a little bit different by four.
But I would guess, I think last session we tracked over 400 bills. We're already over halfway there, 40 something days in. And a lot of the discussion, as Jay and Angie touched upon, has to do with issues that are political in nature, not necessarily about insurance per se. I think TWIA, the bill we were talking about as we started this podcast, I think that's going to generate a lot of attention and heat. And so we just need to keep our members updated, members where you can help us with information on some of these very politically charged issues. I think the industry always tries to respond with facts and data and information. And we're often having to push back against, I'll just politely call it misinformation from the other side. So anything else you can add that our members can either look forward to or dread over the next 98 days?
I think the data privacy, Albert, with House Bill 4 being on the speaker's list of priorities is one they're going to need to look at. It's a fairly broad bill to protect data privacy, and it has an exception for entities subject to federal privacy laws like Gramm-Leach-Bliley, which insurance companies and agents are, but companies have other entities that are not subject to GLB that they need to look at that carefully, because it will regulate what you can share with third parties and what you have to do to protect private information of individuals when you have access to it. And I think that's going to get a lot of attention, particularly in the House.
I think you're right. I think you're exactly right. And a couple other issues, catalytic converter theft and penalties, 3 or 4 bills on that. So something we're interested in. And then 2, I keep bringing up 2 or 3, and some odd bills on public adjusters, suggesting that either A, people don't have access to, or B, are being denied access to, neither of which, as far as I know, is true. But something to keep an eye on. I think both of those are House bills, as I recall.
Right. I think appraisal will be something to watch. See what happens in the auto side. The body shops are wanting appraisal, and saying that if you go to appraisal and lose, if the appraisal award is $1 more, you have to pay their appraisal cost. That, if you think about the number of car claims and that take place that could be subject to appraisal, that could be a huge number. And in inflationary times, could just only add to cost and benefit very few, but cost everybody a lot.
It's a key point, Jay. It's we all know about what's happening with rates and inflation and repair time and severity of losses. So definitely something we need to remind members of as we look at some of these bills and the unintended consequences if some of them happen to pass. Okay, Angie, any parting shots?
No parting shots. I mean, I think another thing going on in the session too that just happened today, we have confirmations for our commissioners. So Commissioner Cassie Brown and Commissioner Jeff Nelson with workers' comp were up in Senate nominations, and that seemed to go well. So they should be headed for confirmation.
Good. We'll keep an eye on that as well. Well, Jay and Angie will have more discussion as session moves on and we get into some details on some of the bills and some of the problems with some of the ideas that we're seeing put out there in this session. But I appreciate y'all's time and look forward to the next 98 days.
It would be interesting, as always.
Who's counting, right? 98 days, 98 and a half.
Thank y'all so much.
Yeah, Albert, Angie, Jay, thank you so much for this. Very informative. Again, this was just kind of highlighting and touching on some of the subjects that are coming up. We're going to probably dig deeper into this ESG issue There's also TWIA funding. There's all sorts of things that are coming down the pike for legislative and legislation issues that may impact our industry. Just a reminder, a couple things coming up in the next few months. March 22nd, we're going to have an all-member update. This is just going to be a webinar, kind of give everybody a rundown of what ICT has been up to up into the first quarter of the year, and then looking at a little bit of the legislative issues. And on March 29th, we have a webinar with Erica Rivera with State Auto Liberty Mutual, talking about some DE&I initiatives and how to implement those into your workplace. And then Firewise, we're going to be talking about wildfires in April. And then, of course, our symposium is July 12th through the 14th up in Dallas. All of these events can be seen on our website at insurancecouncil.org/event calendar. Again, thank you for joining us for today's podcast, and we will talk to you next time. Thank you. This has been a production of the Insurance Council of Texas, Austin, Texas. All rights reserved. Copyright 2023.